challenges that face landlords today, from turnover rates, payment collection, legal challenges, to finding good repair contractors, is worrying about your tenant's insurance. Just one more thing or something that could help you save time and money down the road. Today we will explore the topic with a panel of industry experts. Our panel moderator for today is Dawn Chadwick, self-proclaimed insurance nerd, and I will introduce her now and let her take it away.
I'm Chadwick, as Jake mentioned, the self-proclaimed insurance nerd. Here we have a panel of experts with us today. We have got Dwight Gribble, our claims director for commercial lines, Bill Lorang, our loss control manager, and has been in the loss control space for a number of years with multiple carriers, Nick Minot, specializing in tenant property claims, so fire liability type of losses, and the manager over that team. And then we also have Dan Seymour from the legal department to speak relative to legal side of things, working with multiple carriers throughout his tenure. So as Jake alluded earlier in his description there, tenant insurance is just likely one more thing that landlords have to worry about. So is it truly important? That's what we'd like to cover today. So have a couple of quick stats for you before we jump into the panel. 91% of homeowners actually have insurance, but only 46% of tenants have coverage or tenant insurance. So a big gap there within America. And that's according to the American Insurance Information Institute. The average cost of tenant insurance is only a few $100s, so very affordable coverage, likely accessible to most people, but also can be purchased as cheap as $100 for very minimal coverages. And then out of the renter population in America, typically the 20-somethings are your highest percentage of renters. And then there's been a change in some of the legal challenges throughout rentals and continued trends with challenges in certain spaces, in particular grow operations and legal and illegal as the legal climate changes with that. So how does that impact renters and landlords? And we'll explore that a little bit as well. So without further ado, I'd like to jump into some questions here for our panel of experts. So I think we'll start with Dwight here, and maybe we can talk about common types of losses that landlords see when it comes to their properties.
Okay, thank you, Dawn. Hello, everyone. So in our area, and this is the commercial claim area, our policies typically are covering the landlord exposure, so we write a BOP contract as the normal contract. The type of claims we see are both first and third party claims. So we do see fires in units caused by tenant operations, whether it's cooking or oftentimes smoking related causes of loss. We see some cases that are couched under the term of vandalism that sometimes are problematic for us in the coverage area, in the adjusting area. Those are the typical type of first-party claims we see. And then we'll also see our share of liability claims where we may have an injury in a particular unit that may involve the tenant himself or herself, or might involve a guest of the tenant. And those claims we investigate to determine where the loss occurred. Was it within the unit? Was it in a common area, in a parking lot? Things of that nature. So at a high level, we see your typical first and third party claims as kind of a general statement.
Dwight, what's a first party versus third party claim?
A first party claim is a property claim, would involve a claim on the building coverage, typically on the landlord policy. So I mentioned fire claims. We will see claims presented on BOP where a tenant has cooked or perhaps discarded smoking materials negligently and caused a fire to the structure that we insure on the BOP policy. That's contrasted with a third-party liability claim where there's an allegation of negligence that's presented against the building owner, against the landlord. In those cases, we will have to determine whether, in fact, the landlord had any responsibility or whether the injury, let's say, was caused by the tenant himself or herself.
Great, thank you. Oh, and I didn't mention earlier, but if you do have questions online or in the room, as Jake mentioned, feel free. We do have that available to answer your questions as well. So I guess with that, let's jump into a question for Bill here. How does renter's insurance provide better certainty to landlords? Does this make the tenant more desirable, from your opinion?
Yeah, I think so. It's a form of contractual risk transfer. So a lot of times, like Dwight mentioned, if there's negligence on the tenant's part, some of that liability, or at least maybe the deductible, could be recuperated. Even though we'll pay on the claim, at least they could get their deductible back from the tenant or the tenant's policy. So yeah, I think it's important. I think it also gives an indication of financial stability. So those that can afford renter's insurance can probably also afford their rent. So you have much more financially sound tenant then as well.
So it's one potential step in the screening process for the tenant.
Absolutely, right.
That's great. Awesome. And then you mentioned that the deductible could be recouped, and sometimes deductibles can be $1,000 for landlord policy up to $25,000 and up, so that's a significant advantage. Nick, would you be able to speak at all to kind of how that would work from the tenant's policy perspective? Is there indeed coverage then for the landlord's deductible should the tenant be found at fault for that?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, from a first-party property perspective on that, we do see that situation arise, especially as Dwight was talking about fire claims, especially in situations where there is wide-scale damage, and we find that our first party is negligent on that end of it. There would be a recouping of the deductible on that, especially, let's say, surrounding those building damages. Where we do see a lot of action, at least from my perspective, is when we have losses that would necessarily fall below a commercial deductible. If the landlord had a particular interest of going through their tenant's policy for damages, that way they're taken care of on that end of it. So we do see claims on that aspect of it that fall below a larger deductible, like you said, $25,000.
So in those cases, the landlord doesn't even have to file the claim on their own policy. They can go straight to the tenant's policy in those cases.
That is correct.
Wow, that's great. Awesome. Well then, Nick, since we've got you on the hot seat then, what are some common claims that you see in those situations that landlords could use that tenant insurance for?
We do see a lot of, as Dwight referenced there before, kitchen fires, and again, the smoking related fires on that. In a water plumbing aspect of it, those can also be kind of a large catastrophic loss. You see negligence on certain upkeep of appliances, even, as I referenced this in the temperatures in Madison, Wisconsin today, upkeep of heat, maintaining in the unit themselves. So you will see pipers and those freezing type of related claims on that.
Oh yeah, and that's a very real concern right now
Absolutely.
in much of the U.S. right now with the cold freeze happening. And then so Dan, when we jump to the legal side of things, are there things that you would like to speak to relative to how having a tenant policy for the landlord could be advantageous, such as different coverages and what people presume might be covered, or even we talked earlier about liability being brought into suit. So what would your thoughts be there on why a landlord should carry it from that legal perspective?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. All of the things that have been said so far about the types of claims. Any one of those claims can go into litigation, obviously. I think one of the maybe misconceptions is that you need to have a meritorious claim to file a lawsuit. While that would be nice, and while in the legal community we would like that if that was the case, it's not always the case. So if you had a situation, say, where a tenant suffered a loss to their personal property and they don't have renter's insurance, they may choose to file a suit against the property owner. That suit may or may not be meritorious. That doesn't stop the suit from being filed. And once the suit is filed, the expenses start to incur. And so I mean, one of the things that could happen, that I would expect to have happened if the tenant had a renter's insurance policy to look to first, it could forestall those types of litigation, sort of those pieces of litigation that are sort of less meritorious than others.
That's great. That definitely can avoid a lot of heartburn and a lot of challenges for the landlord should they not be brought into suit in those situations. We actually have a question on here. Given the extreme cold weather we've experienced as of late, any recommendations I can take with my rental property to make sure I don't incur any frozen pipes or other property damage due to the cold weather? So Bill, maybe that would be a perfect question for you.
Yeah, I'd say that insulating pipes that are in attics or crawl spaces where you have a less amount of insulation would be prudent. If you are leaving for any extended periods of time, making sure that heat is maintained at 55 degrees or warmer. If the plumbing is located in the exterior wall, sometimes opening the cabinets underneath the sinks will help get that heat under there and help prevent freezing from that perspective. I think those are the biggies, making sure we have heat, proper insulation, and then I would say even flowing some water through those pipes on a regular basis would also help as well.
Okay, thank you. So then this question maybe will direct to both Dwight and Nick. What does the claims process look like for a landlord that sustained a loss? Let's say they had a fire loss, and versus if their tenant has insurance versus if their tenant doesn't have insurance.
Okay, well, I think from the commercial point of view, the landlord point of view, again, we typically dealing with a BOP policy. So we cover typically the structure, the realty of the building. We don't cover the personal or the personal property owned by the tenant. So if the claim or the loss only involves the personal property, likely that's a claim that Nick's area would get involved with. If the claim involves damage to the building or the unit itself, if the unit becomes unlivable, then the commercial claim would be filed, and we would go out and scope the damage and adjust the claim for the structural damage. Relative to loss of rents, just a quick comment. Sometimes there's a misconception that loss of rents is a gross reimbursement of rents. The policies typically require us to adjust it at a net loss basis. So if, for example, the normal rent is $1,000 a month, the adjustment actually may deduct certain expenses that don't continue, and the net loss maybe of $800 a month may be what's actually payable on the loss of rents claim. So hopefully that addresses it from the personal property.
Yeah, from the tenant side of things, one of the very first things that we would try to do is find out, is the loss location now unlivable? In a tenant insurance base, you do have loss of use coverage. We are usually trying to quick to get somebody in a temporary housing situation, possibly a hotel. Other avenues are sometimes, depending on the size of the property management company or the commercial building itself, landlords will move that renter into another available unit. Say there are no other units available, a lot of people choose to go through their first party coverage, contact us. That way we're getting them into another situation on that, especially if there's any sort of ongoing repairs or time to assess a situation, especially kind of going through that claims process. The second part of the tenant that Dwight was nice to reference there was that personal property end of it, and what we do with that personal property. We try to get various restoration companies in there to determine, is this something that is salvageable? Is it something that is cleanable? A lot of companies will take that off-site. They will charge to store that as they clean that. We also look into having companies look at non-salvageable inventory or debris removal. What we call on that is to get somebody in there to manipulate those contents or get them out. A lot of that is covered under that first-party renter's policy. And what that allows is for us to get that personal property, that contents out of the building, which essentially allows from the commercial BOP end of it to proceed with assessing damages, getting repairs going. That way you both have the tenant out of the space and you have their personal property moving forward. And kind of when those work in conjunction, that's usually the best case scenario.
Oh, that's great.
And I might add, just to amplify what Nick said, sometimes we'll see cases where we have an uninsured tenant, so there's no renter's insurance. And the BOP policy, the building policy, the landlord policy, does not cover, the tenant's additional living expenses. And sometimes there's a misconception out there that the landlord's policy will, reimburse a tenant to go stay in a hotel or something like that. It doesn't. So the BOP really excludes personal property and additional living expenses that the tenant may have a loss involving. And sometimes that's not quite clear.
I was going to ask Dwight, I know there are some states, and I don't know if I didn't do the legal research before this, so can't speak to which states exactly, but I know there are some states, whether they're in our core operating states, I'm not sure, where that if a property suffers damage to the extent where tenants need to go for relocation and have those services, that some states do have statutes that do put the responsibility, or at least some responsibility, on the landlord for relocating those tenants. Now, I get that our policy doesn't address that, but I think Massachusetts is one state, California may be another state, but are you aware of any of our operating states that do that?
Dan, in our footprint states, which we deal with, to my knowledge, we don't have those directives or those statutes that are out there. It may be the case in other state jurisdictions, but from my recollection, I don't recall cases where we've actually had to incur costs relative to the tenant's expenses.
But that's a great point, though, is that might be a coverage gap that maybe in some states, because we've got folks across the country listening in, not just in our operating territory, those 19 states, but outside of there, they may have a coverage gap where maybe legally they have some requirement to help those tenants in those situations, and if they don't have the coverage on their policy, which should stem from the tenants, there is definitely a gap there. That's great. And then
one of the other things I wanted to ask Nick, we had a little bit of a conversation before this, and that is in a situation where the damage may, if you wouldn't mind discussing this, but when a situation where damage may not only be to the unit, the tenant's unit, but to maybe adjacent units, how the renter's policy would approach that. Relatively, we had that conversation prior.
And typically by policy and by state, obviously there's some variances in this, but when we talk about a third-party claim, mostly also in the situation against a tenant, let's say it's something like a cooking fire, or even let's say it's a water situation. Water would be more applicable to what Dan was referencing here. Let's say where we find that the tenant is negligible in causing a water loss. Under most policies, if that water damages the unit that they reside in and the surrounding units, that third party portion of their policy, the liability coverage, will only cover damage to the surrounding units, not the unit they occupy, which is often a gap that not many know going into it. Now, in situations where it's kind of fire, explosion, smoke, there are situations where it will cover the unit of origin and the surrounding units, but water is one of those where they are not being covered for that. So you see a lot of times, I think that's an eye-opening experience for property owners and landlords when they get into that point of a claim, especially against their tenant. Their policy is not covering that, and why on that.
yeah, and when we get specifics, that's where, and you guys jump in on this one and correct me on this one, but we'd really recommend talking specifically with your agent, or if you have a claim open, talking with your claims adjuster on the specifics, because very detailed differences there, as you mentioned, can change the outcome of a claim potentially. And we do have a couple of questions coming in, and one just I think kind of covered is, if pipes burst from cold and tenant has no insurance, does the landlord need to house the tenant? So we kind of touched on this a little bit there, and to summarize, it sounds like depending upon the state and the state laws there, there may be some obligation, but the landlord policy would not have coverage there. The tenant policy is where they would find the coverage, correct?
Yeah, in that situation, like I said, there's pretty much, especially in our core operating states, it would fall on the tenant and their coverage for that type of situation.
Great, thanks. So we have another question of bed bugs and domestic animals has been quite a question by landlords. Is a bed bug coverage something we're looking at? Also, association managers being added as additional interests on the HO4 policy. So I think we've got two questions there into one. One is bed bug and domestic animal coverage, and then also association managers being added as additional insureds. I think that one we might have to table unless you guys have thoughts on either.
On the first question relative to bed bugs and animals, relative to the landlord's exposure, we do see claims presented on the landlord policy for damages caused by animals, a variety of animals. It's interesting sometimes. The BOP typically excludes damage caused by animals or by infestation of insects or bed bugs, for example, from a first-party point of view. So we'll get cases presented to us oftentimes after a tenant has moved out or vacated a property, and frankly, they've trashed the property, and we'll get claims submitted to repair everything. We look at those claims very closely. They're not vandalism claims, they're simply wear and tear or hard living claims, and most of those are not covered on the landlord policy. Frankly, that's why landlords should have security deposits with their tenants. So we typically decline most of those hard living or animal damaged type claims from a first party point of view on the BOP.
Mm-hmm.
What about from like a dog breed, from the liability side? Say tenant has a pet that attacks another tenant or another tenant. Is there coverage there?
Well, there could be coverage on the liability portion of the policy. The question really is there liability or negligence on the part of the landlord. And so we do have to investigate dog bites to understand, did our landlord insured know about the presence of the dog? Do we have a lease or any type of document that was in place that prohibited dogs of any particular breeds? But it's really, did we know as a landlord that there was a risk with a vicious animal, and does that then place negligence on us as a landlord? So we have to investigate those claims, pretty closely. I think it speaks to the need for property owners or landlords to be aware of what's occurring in their premises, to do inspections, to be around, to know what kind of, living conditions are occurring in those properties. And maybe I'd ask Dan from a legal perspective on a dog bite in one of our BOPs where it was the tenant's dog, from the adjusting point of view or our investigation point of view, we may not see negligence, but like you said before, that doesn't prevent a lawsuit from occurring.
That's right, and I think when you get into the animal liability statutes that are in the different states, there are similarities between them, but there are also big differences between those statutes. And knowledge of that animal, knowledge of the propensity of that animal is certainly a factor that would be considered, but also control of that animal is another factor. And how you control can be interpreted many ways. And we've been finding, that in cases that have been coming down, that line is getting more and more blurred, and it's not quite to the point where landlords have responsibility for those animals, but the lines are becoming a little bit more blurred in some of our states. And so it's incumbent upon us as a company to do a complete investigation on those things, as Dwight's been saying. So it is a source of concern, I guess.
And I'll touch on the animals and the bed bug situation just from the renter's policy aspect of it. As Dwight said, oftentimes there's not coverage for that. On the same thing, first party end of it, situations where it's bed bugs, rodents, even domesticated animals causing damage on that to personal property. The majority of the time is there's not coverage for that as well. Liability investigations will have to go on whether the tenant was responsible for that. But again, that's one of those situations where there's a lot of who is responsible for this, both between the commercial and the tenant, and oftentimes there is not coverage.
Well, and then that's where if the landlord's brought into suit and the tenant that owns the dog or the domestic animal, the tenant policy could help out in that situation from the liability perspective, correct?
Potentially, depending on whether negligence was found and how that particular policy reads.
And if there is no policy, this gets back to the meritorious nature of a lawsuit. The a lawsuit could be filed and it's going to go where they perceive the money to be, where they perceive the recovery to be. And if that's on the landlord's policy, that's where the lawsuit will go. Not that it can't be defended, but it's not a prohibition to it being filed.
Right, still requires time, effort, energy, and expense from the landlord in those cases. All right, couple more questions that we've got on here. Can the landlord require tenants carry renter's insurance in their lease, or would that change from state to state regulation? Personally, I know in Wisconsin there are some landlords that already do. Dan, do you have any thoughts on that? Would that maybe vary state by state?
I don't know all the states, but I think it's becoming very commonplace. I think I think the states that might prohibit that would be in the far minority. I think it is becoming an accepted practice. So yeah, I think it is something that can be used.
Great, thanks. All right, let's see here. We've got, would a landlord be able to impose a penalty if a renter does not have a renter's insurance policy? So I think, Dan, if you want to answer that, or if maybe that's one we table, or any thoughts on that?
Well, I have seen, a lot of times what you see is when the lease is signed and the proof of insurance is given, there's nothing to guarantee that how long that insurance will stay in place. It could be a renter's policy that's not synced up with the lease term, and when that renter's policy expires, it's not renewed, and then if there was a provision in the lease, the tenant would be falling out of compliance with that provision. It also could be, I think, renter premiums are not, they're not huge by premium standards, but I think, there is an ability to pay in installments on renter premiums, and there's no way to guarantee if you're the landlord that those payments are being made, those premium payments are being made. I have seen, that could be considered a material breach in the lease. Landlord could have grounds in some jurisdictions and could foresee an eviction notice if they were to take it that far. But I do think if it would be considered a material term of the lease. Non-compliance would be an issue.
Mm-hmm. And in some of those cases, maybe it's best for specific answers to your state to refer back to a local attorney to get advice on how to draw up that lease that would accommodate that situation, correct?
Correct. I'd also say that just part of a good risk management program is that if you're requiring to have our insurance, to at least do an annual check to make sure that policy isn't enforced at least annually.
Mm-hmm. That kind of leads into one of our next questions here is, let's see. Could the landlord be added as an additional insured or interest on a tenant's renter's policy? So we don't actually have any sales folks that typically add coverages and add additional insurance on the panel. So I'm not sure if anybody on the panel wants to take a stab at that.
Well, I would just say from the landlord's point of view, I'd love to see landlords be listed as additional insureds on renters' policies. I don't know whether underwriting is able to add such an endorsement, but it would be a great additional risk transfer protection for the landlord if that were to occur.
I would just say, I mean, we're used to that, we're used to the additional insured sort of mechanism working in a commercial policy.
Correct.
I mean, that happens all, we're used to seeing it in a contractor type situation. To me, I look at the two additional insured and the additional interest as two obviously different things. Additional interest is clearly a good idea if the carrier will do it, because what it does do, when we were talking about the failure to get notice of a cancellation or a lapse in coverage, the additional interest status would give the landlord notice of those things. When the policy is going to cancel, when the policy is maybe being terminated for non-payment, the landlord would receive that. They would get knowledge of that. So that, at least that's what my understanding. Additional insured, like Dwight says, usually when we see it in the commercial context, it puts the additional insured and gives them many of the same coverages that the named insured has. The one concern, though, I would have, or I guess maybe it's two concerns that I have seen, is that additional insured status could result in a dilution of the limits. And by that I mean you've got two parties seeking coverage potentially under the limits, and that might divide the limits and dilute them to the extent that maybe the tenant doesn't get everything that they thought they were getting. That could be a concern. Another concern is it puts, to make a claim, if you're the landlord, to make a claim against the tenant under that policy puts you in an inherent conflict of interest. And those issues are a little bit different than the commercial realm that we would usually see an additional insured situation in. So I don't believe that those would be I don't believe that they would arise all the time, but it would be something to keep in mind if you are going that route.
That's great. Good information and things to think about. So this question we kind of have a little bit answered here, and then, but adding on to it, how does the subrogation process work from a landlord to a tenant? And then the additional portion of the question is, what is the advantages of a landlord needing to be listed as additional insured on the renter's policy, which I think you covered some of those items. But from the claims perspective, would you guys want to weigh in on the subrogation process? I know you guys are not subrogation experts, but a little bit more involved in it.
Sure. So we look at subrogation, which is our right to recover against a responsible party. We look at that really in every claim. And having insurance on the side of the tenant obviously allows, if the tenant is negligent, allows the landlord or the carrier for the landlord to pursue another insurance company through subrogation, which is a much easier process. But subrogation basically means we investigate a claim and determine that someone else besides our insured, besides the landlord, is responsible. So a cooking fire maybe, or careless discarding of smoking material, may be a good example. And we see this with fires that start out on decks, porches and stuff, where people put smoking materials in potted plants, and believe me, they cause big fires. If we can determine that that is the cause and that that was part of the tenant's operation, part of the tenant's negligence, we will notify the tenant that we intend to pursue recovery against either the tenant themselves or the tenant's insurance company based on the amount of money that we pay on the claim. And we will then typically provide all the documentation to the carrier in that subrogation claim. So we do have a lot of success actually in pursuing subrogation when we have a responsible party identified. It's obviously easier when there's a carrier involved. If the tenant is uninsured, it's oftentimes very difficult to get any reimbursement from an uninsured tenant.
One thing that I'd just like to build off on that, oftentimes that comes up with subrogation, as those investigations are ongoing, kind of seeing it from the tenant side of it, it does take some time. And especially it's very advantageous if they are an insured tenant, because then a lot of the times the two different insurance companies are working together on, cause and origin of fires and smoking materials and who left it there and who was negligent. So oftentimes these are not decisions and the process is not very quick on that. So I always like to kind of lay that out both for the tenants on that end of it is, we will pursue this other company for this, or this other person for this. Doesn't mean it's going to happen in a very quick manner. Sometimes they have to respond, whether that policy is enforced, like we talked about. They may have insurance, and you may get, they also may fight that they are not negligent in that matter, even though we are finding them. So there is a timeline to that.
Right. That makes
Just
sense.
a couple of other features on subrogation. Typically, if we receive money back on a subrogation claim, the negligent party's insurance carrier pays the actual cash value of the claim. So we may have a replacement cost coverage on the building, and let's say we pay $100,000. A subrogation claim is always returned typically in an actual cash value or a depreciated amount. So we may not get the full $100,000 back. But what we always do with first dollar recovered is return the insured's deductible. So that's always the first reimbursement that we make upon any recovery that we get in subrogation.
So that could come into play when the tenant doesn't have enough coverage on their policy, or if the loss is so large, type of thing, in those situations, or in the instance of actual cash value, that no matter what, that goes back to, the deductible goes back to the insured first.
Correct. The deductible reimbursement is always the first reimbursement we make upon recovery of a subrogation award.
That's great. Well, and Dwight, you mentioned smoking on the porch and putting the cigarette butts out and causes the fire sometimes. Bill, from the loss control perspective, is there anything that you guys recommend on the loss control side of things in relation to smoking and policies that a landlord should, or at least consider, implementing in their properties?
Yeah, I think awareness is a big key, in at least in the smoking area. Proper extinguishment of smoking materials is key. Dwight mentioned the potted plant. Another scenario we see all the time is the 5-gallon pail full of sand, which is also polluted with trash and refuse and other cigarette butts, things that are combustible, and those things just catch on fire. So we like to see extinguishing materials, the long neck, where it's self-extinguishing and reduces the amount of oxygen that can be there, and then it just avoids propagation of burning and ignition. So the proper receptacles and making sure that they're adequately spaced. I would say in the tenants unit themselves, obviously having fire extinguishers, things like that that are operable should something get away from them. Also emptying those ashtrays, or if you're not using the long neck tubes in your house, because typically you don't see those in a building, where are you discarding your cigarette butts when you're done? Are you throwing them right in the trash can? We prefer to see a metal container with a lid that would close and extinguish that type of thing when you're discarding things from an ashtray.
So I think we covered some of this question, but we'll touch on it here. In case of the tenant starts a fire, whether it be candles, cigarettes, and whatnot, can the landlord policy subrogate against the tenant's policy? It's one portion of the question. And then what happens if there's no HO4 policy or tenant policy? Does the landlord's policy cover this?
Well, the short answer is yes, there's coverage for any fire, regardless of cause. The question here is, do we as a carrier have a right to pursue recovery? And as mentioned, if there's another insurance policy, an HO4, it's much easier. If there's an uninsured tenant, we can certainly still pursue that tenant. We could get a judgment against that tenant, but the likelihood of any funding available becomes very, very remote in most cases with an uninsured tenant. But the cause of the claim, the loss itself, is certainly covered.
Awesome. All right, we've got another question here. I currently live and own a rental property in a state where cannabis is not yet legal. Is there anything I can put in my lease or tenant application that will help with possibly being able to subrogate any potential losses as a result of the property damage or liability that might arise out of growing or smoking these types of substances? Does it differ if they are growing it versus just smoking? That's a big question there, but dissect it a little bit here. So customer currently located in a state where cannabis is not legal, and looking for advice on is there coverage, and does it differ versus growing a grow operation, or maybe even growing personal plants, versus if the tenant is smoking?
I'd say on the first one, at least on the growing operation, what you put in your lease will be important there, right? Because in this scenario, it's not legal in that state. So I've seen leases where, any illegal activity, is against the policy. Obviously consult with your attorney to make sure that that language will hold up. But just having a provision in your lease that says that, we don't allow that here, I think would help with some.
And I can speak from the tenant end, in a similar, in a lot of policies, from a third-party liability aspect of it, you'll see a lot of reference to illegal activities, voiding our being held liable in those situations. So that terminology, both on the lease and on the policy end, is seen often.
I imagine that's caused some challenges as some states are going legal, some states are not, and defining that is probably a challenge on that side of things.
I'd say even if it is legal in that state, as somebody who's running their own business, you still have the right to say you don't want that operation in your lease agreement. Again, making sure that your attorney has the proper wording for your stickers.
And I think, Bill, you mentioned checking with your local attorney. That probably is, I'd say, the best bet to do is checking with local attorney, as they'll know the state laws and guidelines that they need to follow and write the best language for that particular state, correct? That's great. This one I'm not sure if we'll be able to answer. Anybody feel free to jump in on this, but it is, if the renter has no insurance and is considered liable, will the landlord claim affect their premiums? So that's a pretty tricky question to answer, given that likely varies by carrier, by state, by product type. So if anybody wants to jump in on that, definitely jump in. Otherwise, what I would recommend in that particular case, touching base with your local agent, and they have connections in with the company that can advise on questions specific to coverages and rates. Is that fair? All right, and I think we've touched on this a little bit, but let's go ahead and, if landlord is added as TPI, then he would in fact receive notice of payments, correct? And this one, again, is maybe an underwriting agent-specific question that the agent can reach out to their underwriter to confirm, but if anybody wants to jump in on that, feel free.
I think to Dan's point earlier, I think there may be notice of cancellation as a third-party interest if the policy goes out of force. I'm not certain that they're notified every time a premium payment is made.
Oh, that's a good point, Dwight. Yep.
And I'm not sure that all carriers providing renters insurance provide those options either. I mean, they are provided by some, but I wouldn't say that I could say they were provided by all.
So we've talked about a lot of different things here. Now I wonder, Dwight, what's one, I guess, advice or one thing you wish that landlords knew from your time and experience in claims from the commercial side of things? Is there anything that you wish you could tell every landlord that would make their life easier?
Sure. And Bill alluded to a proper risk management approach. We've seen some terrible claims in terms of loss of life and that sort of thing, in fires particularly. And I can't, I guess, stress the importance enough from the landlord's perspective of making sure that all your units have proper smoke detectors, that they're in working order, that if carbon monoxide detectors are required in your area, that they're present in the right locations and in working order. We will get claims where renters or family members perish in a fire, and then a liability claim may be presented against the landlord because there may or may not have been smoke detectors. The batteries may not have been checked or maintained on a regular basis. Oftentimes, tenants who smoke take the batteries out because their smoking habit sets the smoke detectors off all the time. but we can't minimize the exposure that the landlord has to provide a safe place, proper egress. If you have, renters in a basement, do they have a proper way to get out and stuff like that? So I think the accountability on the part of the landlord to make sure that the property is in safe and up-to-date working and livable conditions can't be overstated as far as that goes.
That's great. Thank you, Dwight. I'd ask the same of you, Bill.
Yeah, I think echo everything that Dwight just said. And insurance is a form of risk financing, but it is not a substitute for good risk management controls and practices. So we do have a lot of really good materials on our amfam.com website. So I'd encourage you as landlords to take a look at what's out there. You'd find it under the business section, under resources. Lots of great articles out there. We got a couple of different brochures and bulletins that I brought with me today, but there's volumes of stuff out there. So having an effective risk management programming, knowing what your risk is, and then putting control measures in place to prevent loss in addition to insurance is the most important thing that I would say.
Nick, what about you from the tenant side of things, or that perspective? Any recommendations or things that you wish that landlords knew or were aware of?
Yeah, I'd say from the tenant perspective on that, a lot of times what we see is when tenants suffer a loss, and most common what we're seeing is large-scale fires, that they are looking back to the landlord or the landlord's BOP to do a lot of things for them. We talked about that loss of use, that hotel cost. What are you going to do with my personal property? And a lot of that is where a lot of doors are closed on them, and there is assumption of coverage. We've even seen some landlords where they, I don't want to say, talked about coverage or thought that they were there for their tenant on that. And then there's also an aspect of that relationship, what they were informed of, and obviously there's long-term ramifications of that. But I would say that tenant policy in there is really that first line of defense. Get them moving, get their personal property going, and that allows you as that building owner to start that recovery process on that. One of the biggest things that I always say from the tenant aspect of it, if you're a landlord reviewing that, proper coverage and limits. That is something that we see on a state-by-state basis, whether it's a proper personal property limits or the proper loss of use limits. We do see sometimes those can run out fairly quickly, putting the tenant in an awkward position and also the landlord in a position where there might be remaining debris that's not being immediately removed, and especially losses where they're not being claimed under the commercial policy.
Well, that's a great point. And when we look at some of the stats in the early 20-somethings being a large population of the renters out there, they may not know what limits or what they need to cover. And so when we talk about that $100 policy, that you can get a policy as cheap as $100, that likely isn't all the coverage that the customer needs in that case, correct?
Yes. And oftentimes we do see that limits of what I would say is in both the commercial and the restoration companies and that work, those costs escalate very quickly on that. So those limits can be absorbed.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I would say, obviously consult with your insurance agent, because knowing what you have and what you're looking to insure, that's what they do, right? Mm-hmm. They know through their discussions with you how much coverage you need, can help find the proper coverage for you, and then make sure that everybody's taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think at one point Nick earlier mentioned that the relocation, we talked about Chicago or a large urban area relocating and only having a couple $1,000s to relocate may be quite a challenge there. Yeah, that's great points there. So I think, Dan, maybe we ask from the legal perspective, what, not necessarily advice, because I know the legal folks generally don't like to give the legal advice and often advise to speak with your local attorney, but anything that you wish that landlords knew or feel that they need to be aware of or should be considering?
Well, I think if you're considering adding something like this to your lease about the requirement about renter's insurance, I think one of the things I would say is consider your tenant base. I can tell you that from a personal experience, I have a son who's a student here in Madison on campus, and he moved into a place, And they had such a requirement. They required the renter's insurance. They even told us where we should go to get it, which was nice of them to do that. But I reviewed my policy, our homeowner's policy, and I pointed out to them that all the coverages, all the things that they wanted, that coverage was available to my son under our policy, and they would not hear it. They would not change the policy that you had to have a separate renter's policy. So I guess that's one of the things I would say is consider your tenant base. The other thing is I was driving here today, I was wondering, and I don't know the answer to this, but I was wondering about tenants that use Section 8 type tenants or other type of government funded programs. The idea behind those programs are to aid in housing, and I'm a little bit concerned that putting a restriction and requirement of requiring tenant or renter's insurance might be counter to the purposes of those programs. So I would just say if that is a large portion of your tenant base, I would say look into that, check with somebody, because that requirement might run afoul of what the purpose of those programs are for.
When in those cases, maybe there is additional programs that the government offers or things like that. Because I had imagined if they're having income challenges, having a loss would also cause a significant challenge for those folks as well. So with that, we do have one more question on here. Oh, sorry. It was directed at me, the mic. I apologize on that one. So hopefully you guys can hear me a little bit better now. There was a couple other questions that we did talk a little bit about with the smoke controls. You mentioned having programs in place for where the actual smoke or the cigarette butt should go, Bill. Anything that they should consider as far as putting that in their lease, as far as making the building a smoke-free building, or anything that you'd like to talk to in reference to the smoke-free idea or concept?
Yeah, we're seeing more and more of that. In fact, I was just in a survey and upcoming webinar on this topic for the state of Minnesota. But we're seeing more of that. Smoking becoming less and less acceptable within buildings, both in public buildings and now in these residences as well. So from a risk standpoint, obviously our risk is minimized when there is no smoking in those buildings, so we'd like to see that as a control. I think, to the earlier points about knowing your tenants, if you're looking to attract any and all tenants, then maybe a no smoking policy might not work for you. But if you're only looking for a certain type of tenants, I consider a no smoking policy, because I think you'll do yourself some favors. And I know there's some discounts available for buildings that are smoke-free, as well as those that have designated smoking areas where smoking can only take place in those specific areas.
Oh, that's great. Any insight as to, has that been effective in particular states, or have we, after a smoke-free building, have we seen any fire losses from that, or any resulting actions that we've seen?
I think the data's still coming.
Still
It's
coming.
relatively new, but just from a pure risk management standpoint, and Dwight can probably back this, is that, in this space, when you asked him for what types of losses we're seeing fires due to uncontrolled smoking, are fairly frequent. So if we can eliminate that exposure altogether, I think we're in a better spot.
I'd agree. It's an excellent risk management approach for a property owner or a landlord. It doesn't mean, however, that if there is a claim involving smoking, that it's excluded. It's still a covered claim. But we see less claims in those risks that are smoke-free.
Well, that's great. Even though it's covered, it still saves
Correct.
the landlord time, effort, energy, their deductible, potentially if not able to subrogate in those cases. So an overall better experience for them.
And you'll see too, when you turn over tenants, they have less painting to do because of discoloration, less carpet cleaning to do because of fumes and odors. I mean, so, you know, as a landlord, ease of doing business also.
Awesome. Well, these are the majority of the covered questions that we had. Just want to take a quick moment, see if there's any other online questions and or any in-person questions here. And anything else that you guys would like to add, or any things that we haven't covered that you were hoping to cover today?
Just one quick other piece on risk management, record keeping, and so forth, and being here in Wisconsin. Making sure as a landlord that you have proper tracking of any contractors that you may hire to plow snow, to clean sidewalks, that sort of thing. And any of the maintenance people that may do regular maintenance within the units. If you keep time logs and that sort of thing, it's very, very helpful at the time of a potential claim that we can work with you to get those records. To know, you know, that sidewalks are cleared in certain weather conditions, who the contractor may be, do they have insurance, and that sort of thing. So proper documentation on your maintenance and the vendors that you use is really a helpful hint from our perspective.
So,
And battery changeouts and smoke alarms, absolutely.
Yeah, follow the daylight savings patterns twice a year. Just do it when the time zone or the times change your batteries. It's easy way to.
so probably a little bit more work up front to keep track of that, but in the long run, a lot more effective to keep track of it as you're going versus trying to gather that at the time of loss when you're having that challenging time.
Yeah, I mean, from a claims adjuster perspective, you know, we're a partner with you in managing your risk, but it's a partnership. And as a landlord, there's things you need to do, and as an insurance company, there's things we need to do, but we need to partner together. And the record keeping and all of that really is important on your side as a landlord to help us in the event or when the claim occurs. So.
Yeah, we do have sanding, salting, and shoveling example log on the mfam.com website. So if you're looking for an example of what to fill out that Dwight's referencing, there's examples of that on the website. Really just shows that you're doing your due diligence in weather like this to provide as safe an environment as you possibly can for your tenants and the general public.
And Bill, is that free information out on the AmFam website?
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
And is it for customers and non-customers of
Yep,
American Family?
anyone can access it. You don't need a password, a policy number, or anything.
Oh, great. Awesome. It's really great. Any other things that you guys wanted to add? I think we're out of questions here, so
Nope.
we're set. We'll turn it back over to Jake.
All right, thanks, sir. Everyone on our panel, I hope everyone online and in person learned a little something that they can take back and let their tenants, let their landlords know about some additional ways that you can help take care of it.